The park bench was cold, the iron seeping a damp chill through the thin fabric of my jeans, but I didn't move. Beside me, a golden retriever with a coat the color of old honey rested his heavy head on my knee. His breathing was a steady, warm puff against my leg, a small engine of trust in a world where I'd learned to be wary of such things. He wasn't my dog. I had no idea whose dog he was, but he'd been wandering near the fountain with a look of quiet panic in his intelligent brown eyes, his leash dragging behind him like a forgotten question. I had coaxed him over with a soft voice and a piece of the squash granola bar from my pocket. He'd sniffed my hand, his wet nose a gentle probe, and then leaned against me as if we were old friends. Now we just sat. The late afternoon sun filtered through the autumn leaves, painting the paved path in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. This was my ritual, my one small luxury. An hour in Crestwood Park, a place far too elegant for the neighborhood I actually lived in. It was a place of manicured lawns and old-money silence, a world away from my cramped apartment with its peeling paint and rattling pipes. The dog, whose collar tag read Atlas in small, neat script, sighed again. The weight of his head was a comfort, a grounding presence. It had been a long time since anything had willingly chosen to lean on me. My life was a carefully constructed fortress of solitude, built brick by brick after everything had fallen apart 2 years ago. I worked from home, a freelance graphic designer picking up jobs that paid just enough to keep the lights on and the landlord from knocking. My interactions were mostly digital, a series of emails and project files that kept human messiness at a safe distance. But this dog, this Atlas, was undeniably real. His fur was soft under my fingers, smelling faintly of clean earth and something like cedar. I checked his tag again. Atlas below it. A phone number was engraved. I called it twice. The first time, it went straight to a crisp, professional voicemail. The second time, it rang and rang until silence took over. I'd left a message, my voice sounding thin and uncertain in the quiet park. Hi. I think I have your dog. His name is Atlas. We're on a bench by the main fountain in Crestwood Park. He's safe. I stroked his broad, golden head, my fingers tracing the line of his ears. He was beautifully cared for. His coat was brushed, his nails were trimmed, and the leather of his collar was soft and worn in a way that spoke of constant, gentle use. Someone loved this dog very much. The thought sent a strange, hollow ache through my chest. It was a feeling I recognized but rarely named, a deep, quiet yearning for connection, the kind I watched from the outside looking in. It was in this park that I often saw him. The man who, I suspected, belonged to this dog. I didn't know his name, but I knew his presence. He was older, maybe in his early 50s, with silver at his temples that caught the light like threads of frost. He moved with an unhurried grace that seemed to calm the very air around him. He was always dressed in simple, well-made clothes, dark trousers, a soft cashmere sweater, a tailored coat when the weather turned. He never rushed. He'd walk, Atlas trotting happily beside him, and sometimes he'd sit on this very bench, looking out at the city skyline with an expression I could never quite read. It wasn't sad, not exactly. It was still, as if he were listening to a conversation only he could hear. I had sketched him once, in a small notebook I carried. I hadn't meant to. My pencil had just started moving, trying to capture the steady line of his shoulders, the quiet set of his jaw. It was a foolish, secret thing, this observation of a stranger. He represented a kind of stability I couldn't imagine for myself, a life settled and secure. He was a pillar in a world where I felt like a leaf in the wind. And his dog, this warm, solid creature now dozing on my lap, was a part of that world. A crisp snap of a twig broke the quiet. My head shot up. A man was walking briskly down the path, his long coat flaring out behind him. It was him, the man from my sketchbook. His face, which I had only ever seen in thoughtful repose, was etched with worry. His eyes, a shade of gray that seemed to absorb the fading light, scanned the area around the fountain, sweeping past me and Atlas before snapping back. For a moment, he just stood there, his shoulders, which always seemed so broad and steady, visibly relaxed. The tension drained from his face, replaced by a wave of relief so profound it was almost tangible. His gaze met mine, and I felt a sudden, absurd jolt of self-consciousness. I was just a guy on a bench, my jacket frayed at the cuffs, my hair probably a mess from the wind. He was him. He closed the distance in a few long strides, his expensive leather shoes making almost no sound on the pavement. He didn't look at me at first. His attention was entirely on the dog. "Atlas," he said, and his voice was exactly as I'd imagined it. Low and calm, with a warm, gravelly texture. It was a voice that could soothe frayed nerves or command a boardroom with equal ease. Atlas's head lifted from my knee. His tail gave a few heavy thumps against the bench, a sleepy, happy rhythm. He stretched, yawning widely, then trotted over to the man, pressing his head against his owner's leg. The man's hand came down, sinking into the thick fur of the dog's neck, his fingers stroking with a familiar, practiced motion. He was murmuring something too low for me to hear, his entire being focused on this reunion. I watched them, feeling like an intruder on a private moment. I should just go. My part in this was over. I started to gather myself, shifting to stand up, but the man finally looked at me. His gray eyes were clear and direct, holding my gaze without aggression, without judgment. They were just assessing. "You called," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Twice. I left a message. My phone was on silent." "A meeting." He offered the words as a simple explanation, not an excuse. "Thank you." I was worried. The admission was understated, but I could hear the depth of it in that single word. This dog wasn't a pet. He was family. "He's a good dog," I said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He just seemed a little lost. I didn't want him to wander into the street. The man's gaze softened. It was a subtle shift, a slight easing around his eyes, but it changed his entire expression from one of polite reserve to something warmer. "That was good of you. I'm Arthur Vance." He extended a hand. I took it. His grip was firm and dry, his hand warm against my own, which suddenly felt cold and clammy. "Leo," I said. "Just Leo." My last name didn't seem important. He held my hand for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. The touch was nothing, a fleeting accident of a handshake, but it sent a startling warmth up my arm. He let go, and the absence of his touch was as noticeable as its presence had been. "I'd like to thank you properly, Leo," he said, reaching for his wallet. "Please, let me compensate you for your time." My stomach tightened. This was the transaction. The part where his world and my world met, exchanged currency, and then separated again. I felt an immediate, prickly need to refuse, to keep this small moment clean of that imbalance. "No, that's not necessary," I said, maybe a little too quickly. Anyone would have done the same. I was just sitting here anyway. Arthur paused, his wallet halfway out of his coat pocket. He studied my face again, and I felt that calm, assessing gaze take me in. He wasn't just looking at me. He seemed to be reading me, noting the worn denim of my jeans, the slight tremor in my hands that I couldn't quite control. I felt exposed, seen in a way that was both unnerving and, strangely, not unpleasant. He wasn't judging. He was just observing. He slid the wallet back into his pocket. "All right," he said slowly, as if considering another angle. "But you did me a significant service. Atlas is important." He looked down at the dog, who was now sitting patiently by his side, leaning against his leg. "Perhaps there's another way." I didn't know what to say to that. A simple, "You're welcome," seemed insufficient. A nervous energy buzzed under my skin. I just wanted to retreat back to the safety of my anonymity, back to being the guy who sketches strangers in the park, not the guy who talks to them. Arthur's eyes drifted to the worn satchel at my feet, the corner of my sketchbook peeking out. His gaze was curious, not invasive. "What do you do, Leo?" The question was direct, but his tone made it feel like genuine interest. "I'm a graphic designer," I mumbled, feeling a flush of heat creep up my neck. It sounded so much less impressive than whatever he did. "Freelance." A flicker of something, understanding maybe, crossed his face. He nodded thoughtfully. "I see." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as if he were connecting invisible dots. Atlas nudged his hand, and Arthur absently began stroking the dog's ears again, the motion smooth and rhythmic. "I find myself in need of a designer," he said, his voice measured. "It's a private project. For my family's charitable foundation. We need a new website designed, something clean, discreet, and functional. It's not a massive undertaking, but it requires a good eye." My heart gave a strange, hopeful leap, which I immediately tried to crush. This was pity. This was him finding a more palatable way to give me money for finding his dog. I opened my mouth to refuse again, to say I was too busy, to make some excuse. But he spoke first, as if sensing my retreat. "This isn't charity, Leo," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's a real job, and I would pay you your professional rate. I've been meaning to hire someone for weeks, but I dislike working with large agencies. I prefer a more personal approach." He looked at me directly. "I would consider it a favor to me if you would at least look at the project brief. If it doesn't interest you, or if you're not available, there's no obligation." He was making it impossible to say no without being rude. He was offering an opportunity, framed with impeccable boundaries and clear respect for my agency. It wasn't a handout, it was a contract. And God, I needed the work. My last project had ended a month ago, and my savings were dwindling at an alarming rate. I swallowed my pride. I swallowed my fear. "Okay," I heard myself say. I can look at the brief." A small, genuine smile touched Arthur Vance's lips. It transformed his face, erasing the last of his reserve and revealing a startling warmth. "Good," he said. He reached into his coat again, but this time he pulled out a slim, elegant business card. "This is my personal number. Send me a link to your portfolio, and I'll email you the details this evening." I took the card. The paper was thick and heavy, the lettering embossed in a simple, classic font. Arthur Vance, no title, no company name, just his name. It felt solid and real in my hand, a tangible link to a world I had only ever observed from a distance. "Thank you," I said, and this time, the words felt right. "No," he corrected me gently, his gray eyes holding mine. "Thank you." He gave Atlas's leash a soft tug. "Come on, boy. Time to go home." He gave me one last nod, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, and then he turned and walked away, the man and his dog moving together in perfect, practiced harmony, leaving me alone on the cold bench with a heavy business card and a heart that was beating far too fast. I stayed there until the last of the sunlight had faded, until the park lamps flickered on, casting long, lonely shadows on the path. The warmth from Atlas's head still lingered on my jeans, a phantom sensation. I had come to the park seeking solitude, and instead, I had found a connection, however brief. A door had been opened, just a crack. I was terrified of what might be on the other side, but for the first time in a very long time, I was also filled with a fragile, unfamiliar sense of hope. That night, I agonized over the email. I spent an hour curating a small, potent selection of my best work for the portfolio link. My hands shook as I typed out a brief, professional message. "Mr. Vance, it was a pleasure to meet you and Atlas this afternoon. As requested, here is a link to my portfolio. I look forward to reviewing the project brief. Sincerely, Leo." I read it over a dozen times, checking for typos, for any hint of desperation. Finally, with a deep breath, I hit send. The reply came less than 10 minutes later. It was concise and to the point. The project brief was attached, a well-organized document outlining the foundation's mission and the website's required functionality. The final line of the email read, "Your work is excellent. Your aesthetic is precisely what I'm looking for. Let me know your hourly rate and when you might be available to start." Arthur, I read that first sentence, "Your work is excellent," over and over again. It was simple, professional praise, but it landed in my chest like a bomb. In the anonymous world of freelance work, feedback was rare and often critical. To be seen, to have my skill acknowledged so plainly by a man like Arthur Vance, felt like a quiet validation I hadn't known I was starving for. We agreed on a rate that made my head spin. It was more than double what I usually charged, but he accepted it without hesitation. He suggested I come to his home office the following Monday to get started. "It will be easier to collaborate if we're in the same space, at least initially," he had written. "I have all the source materials here." The idea of being in his home sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. My world was my tiny apartment, my fortress. His world was, well, I was about to find out. The address he sent was for a penthouse apartment in one of the most exclusive buildings overlooking the park. Of course it was. The days leading up to Monday were a blur of nervous energy. I cleaned my best shirt 3 times. I worried about what to bring, how to act. By the time I was standing in the gleaming, silent lobby of his building, my satchel clutched in my hand, I felt hopelessly out of my depth. A polite doorman announced my arrival, and a private elevator whisked me upwards, the ride so smooth it felt like I was floating. The elevator opened directly into his apartment. The space was breathtaking. It wasn't opulent or gaudy. It was calm and vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the park and the city beyond. The furniture was minimalist and elegant, a mix of dark wood, soft leather, and cool stone. It was a space designed for quiet contemplation, a reflection of the man himself. Arthur was standing by the window, a mug in his hand. He turned as I stepped out of the elevator, and that same small, warm smile appeared. "Leo, welcome. You're punctual." "I try to be," I said, my voice a little tight. A happy bark announced Atlas's arrival. The big golden retriever trotted over, tail wagging, and nudged my hand with his nose as if we were old friends. I couldn't help but smile as I bent down to scratch behind his ears. The simple, honest affection of the dog was a grounding force in this intimidating space. "He remembers you," Arthur said, his voice laced with a gentle amusement. "Coffee, please," I said, grateful for the simple offer. He led me to a kitchen that was a marvel of stainless steel and dark marble, yet it felt lived in. A well-used espresso machine hissed softly on the counter. He moved around the space with an easy, efficient grace, preparing a mug of coffee for me. He didn't ask how I took it. He just set out cream and sugar on the counter for me to help myself. It was a small gesture, but it felt respectful, allowing me to make my own choices in his space. His office was just off the main living area. It was as elegant and understated as the rest of the apartment, dominated by a large, clean desk made of a single piece of dark, polished wood. One wall was lined with bookshelves, filled not just with books, but with interesting objects, a piece of weathered driftwood, a collection of old maps, a small, intricate sculpture of gears. It was the office of a man with a curious and orderly mind. He had set up a second workspace for me at a table adjacent to his desk. A brand new monitor, still in its box, sat beside a comfortable-looking ergonomic chair. "I thought this would be more comfortable for you than hunching over a laptop," he explained. "Please, make the space your own. Let me know if you need anything at all." Again, I was struck by his thoughtfulness. He hadn't just made room for me. He had considered my needs, my comfort. He was creating an environment not of subservience, but of collaboration. The power imbalance between us was an undeniable fact, his wealth, his age, his sheer presence. But he seemed to be doing everything he could to minimize it, to put us on an equal footing as professionals. We spent the first few hours going over the project materials. He was organized and articulate, explaining the foundation's goals with a quiet passion that surprised me. He spoke of funding arts programs for underprivileged schools, of supporting environmental conservation efforts. This wasn't some vanity project. It was work he cared about deeply. As we worked, I began to relax. The initial intimidation of the space faded into a background hum. My focus narrowed to the task at hand: color palettes, typography, user interface design. This was my world, my area of expertise. And Arthur treated it as such. He listened to my ideas intently, asked intelligent questions, and deferred to my judgment on matters of design. I fell into a rhythm. The quiet clicks of my mouse and keyboard mingled with the soft rustle of papers from his desk. Atlas snoozed at our feet, his occasional sleepy sighs a gentle punctuation to the silence. It was the most peaceful and productive work environment I had ever experienced. I found myself watching Arthur when he wasn't looking. I studied the way he'd lean back in his chair, rubbing his chin in thought. I watched the focused intensity in his eyes as he read a document, his brow furrowed in concentration. And I watched his hands. They were capable and strong, with long, elegant fingers. He'd gesture with them as he spoke, a quiet and expressive language all their own. One afternoon, I was struggling with a particular design element. I had been staring at the screen for 20 minutes, moving a block of text a few pixels to the left, then a few pixels to the right, unable to get it to feel balanced. A quiet frustration was building in my chest. Arthur must have sensed it. "Stuck?" he asked, his voice gentle. I sighed, leaning back. "A bit. The composition feels off. I can't put my finger on why." He stood up and walked over to my station, his presence a sudden, warm weight beside me. He didn't crowd me, but I was acutely aware of his proximity, the faint, clean scent of his cologne, something subtle and woodsy. He leaned over slightly to look at my screen, his arm brushing against my shoulder. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure, unadulterated awareness shot through me, sharp and swift. My breath hitched. It was nothing, a complete accident, but my body reacted as if I'd touched a live wire. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. His focus was on the screen. "What if you increased the leading between these lines?" he suggested, pointing a finger at the screen. His finger hovered just inches from mine. "And maybe give the whole block a little more negative space to breathe." His suggestion was a good one. A simple, elegant solution that I had completely overlooked in my frustration. But I could barely process the words. All I could think about was the warmth of his arm against mine, the low timbre of his voice so close to my ear. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, silent drumbeat. "Right?" I managed to say, my voice sounding strained. "Yes, that's a good idea." He straightened up, breaking the contact. The air rushed back into my lungs. "Just a thought," he said, and walked back to his desk as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. A line had been crossed, not in reality, but inside me. The carefully constructed wall between Leo the professional and Leo the lonely, yearning man had just been breached. My attraction to him, which had been a vague, abstract thing, an admiration for his steadiness, an appreciation of his quiet grace, had just become sharp and specific and painfully real. I made the change he suggested. It worked perfectly. The design snapped into place, balanced and clean. But my hands were unsteady for the rest of the afternoon. Every time he moved, every time he spoke, I was hyper-aware of him. The quiet foundation of our professional arrangement had suddenly developed a tremor, a fault line of unspoken feeling running right through its center. The days settled into a new kind of routine. I would arrive at 10, work through the day in the quiet, sun-filled office, and leave around 6. Arthur was a constant, steady presence. He was never overbearing, but always available. We didn't talk much about personal matters. Our conversations were about the project, about design theory, about current events we'd read about in the news. It was comfortable, professional, and yet charged. I learned his habits. I learned that he drank his coffee black. I learned that he always took a break at 3 o'clock to take Atlas for a short walk in the building's private rooftop garden. I learned that when he was deeply focused, he had a habit of pushing his glasses up his nose with his middle finger, a small, unconscious gesture that I found inexplicably endearing. The internal analysis became a constant hum in the back of my mind. I would replay our small interactions, searching for meaning. When he said, "That's very insightful, Leo," was there a warmer note in his voice than usual? When he passed me a document and our fingers brushed, did he let the touch linger, or was I imagining it? It was a maddening, exhilarating game of interpretation, and I was losing myself in it. The meaningful touches, as I started to call them in my head, were small and fleeting, always plausibly deniable. A hand on my back to guide me through a doorway. A brush of shoulders as we both reached for the same book on the shelf. Each one was a tiny spark that lit up my nerve endings, leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. I never knew if they were intentional. I suspected they weren't. But that ambiguity was part of the tension. It allowed me to hope. One rainy Thursday, the project was nearing its final stages. The weather was miserable, a cold, persistent drizzle that matched the gray of the sky. We had ordered in lunch, eating at the small table in his kitchen. The conversation was easy, flowing from the website's launch plan to a new exhibition at the city's art museum. "You should go," he said, after I'd mentioned my interest in the artist. "I have a membership. I could leave a guest pass for you at the front desk if you'd like." "Oh, no, I couldn't," I said immediately, the old instinct to refuse any favor kicking in. He looked at me, his expression patient. "Why not, Leo? It's a pass that would otherwise go unused. It's no trouble. I would be happy to know it was being put to good use." He said it so simply, so reasonably, that my refusal felt churlish. He wasn't offering a handout. He was sharing something he enjoyed. "Okay," I said, feeling my cheeks warm. "Thank you, Arthur. I'd like that." "Good," he said, and the way he looked at me held a softness that made my breath catch. It felt like we were talking about more than just a museum pass. It felt like he was gently, patiently, dismantling the walls I had built around myself, one small gesture of kindness at a time. Later that afternoon, as the rain intensified, drumming against the vast windows of the office, we hit a technical snag with the website's code. It was a frustrating, complex problem that required both of us hunched over my monitor, tracing lines of code. "There," he said suddenly, pointing. "That semicolon shouldn't be there. That's what's breaking the script." I leaned in closer to see, my head next to his. I could smell the faint scent of rain on his coat, mixed with that subtle, woodsy cologne. His cheek was only inches from mine. I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the texture of his skin. The urge to close that small distance, to turn my head and see what would happen, was so overwhelming it made me dizzy. "I am here to work. This is a job. He is my client." The words were a frantic mantra in my head, a desperate attempt to regain control. I pulled back abruptly, my chair rolling back a few inches. "You're right," I said, my voice hoarse. I quickly deleted the offending semicolon. "That fixed it. Thanks." Arthur straightened up, looking at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were searching mine. Did he feel it too? That sudden, suffocating tension that had filled the space between us? Or was it all in my head, a product of my own lonely, hopeful imagination? "Are you all right, Leo?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. "You seem distracted." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired. Long day." He didn't look convinced, but he let it go. He walked over to the window, looking out at the rain-streaked city. "The storm is getting worse," he said, his back to me. "The traffic will be a nightmare. You shouldn't travel home in this." My heart began to pound. I knew what was coming. "I have a guest suite," he said, turning back to face me. "It's perfectly comfortable. You're welcome to stay the night. We can finish the last of the project in the morning." The offer hung in the air between us. It was practical, it was sensible, and it was terrifying. To stay here, in his home, overnight, it felt like a point of no return. The professional boundary, already so blurred, would dissolve completely. But the thought of the long, cold journey back to my empty apartment in the driving rain was deeply unappealing. And a part of me, a reckless, hopeful part, wanted to stay. It wanted to see what would happen when the pretense of our professional relationship was stripped away, even for just one night. "You don't have to decide now," he added, sensing my hesitation. "Work for another hour. See if the rain lets up. The offer stands regardless." He was giving me an out, preserving my choice, my agency. He always did that. An hour later, the rain was coming down in solid sheets, and the sky was a dark, bruised purple. There was no question of leaving. I accepted his offer, my voice barely a whisper. "Good," he said simply. "I'll get the room ready. Why don't you shut down for the night? We've done enough." He showed me to the guest suite. It was larger than my entire apartment, with a king-sized bed, its own luxurious bathroom, and a small balcony overlooking the city. A set of new, still-packaged pajamas and a toothbrush were laid out on the bed. He had thought of everything. "Make yourself comfortable," he said from the doorway. "I was going to make some pasta for dinner. I hope that's all right." "That sounds perfect," I said, feeling a sense of surreal domesticity settle over me. When I came out to the kitchen a little while later, wearing the soft, ridiculously comfortable pajamas, he was at the stove, stirring a pot of simmering tomato sauce. The air was filled with the warm, savory scent of garlic and basil. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his glasses perched on his nose. He looked soft, less like the imposing, wealthy man from the park and more like just a man, at home in his kitchen. He handed me a glass of red wine. "To a nearly completed project," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. We ate at the kitchen island, the city lights twinkling like a fallen constellation outside the window. The pasta was simple and delicious. The conversation flowed easily. We didn't talk about work. Instead, he asked me about where I grew up, about the small town I had been so desperate to escape. I found myself telling him things I hadn't told anyone. I told him about my parents, about my brief, disastrous attempt at art school, about the failed business partnership that had cost me my savings and my confidence 2 years ago. The words just came out, drawn from me by his quiet, non-judgmental attention. He just listened, his head tilted slightly, his gray eyes full of a deep, compassionate understanding. When I finally trailed off, feeling exposed and raw, he was silent for a moment. "That sounds difficult," he said finally. His voice was full of a quiet empathy that soothed the ragged edges of my confession. "But you rebuilt. You're standing on your own. That takes a great deal of strength, Leo." His praise went straight to my heart. He didn't see me as a failure. He saw me as strong. Then, he offered a piece of himself in return. "I know something of starting over," he said, his gaze becoming distant. "My wife passed away 10 years ago. It was sudden." He swirled the wine in his glass. "The company I had built, our life together, it all felt hollow. For a long time, I just went through the motions. The foundation was the first thing I started that felt like it had meaning again. It was a way to build something new from the wreckage." The quiet admission of his own past grief was an incredible gift. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a deliberate act of trust. He was showing me the man behind the wealth, behind the stoic facade. He was showing me his scars. "I'm sorry," I said softly. He shook his head, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "It was a long time ago, but the quiet never really goes away. You just learn to live with it." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "Sometimes, I worry that people see this." He gestured around the vast, beautiful apartment, "and they assume it's a fortress, that I use it to keep the world out. And maybe I do, but I also worry that it's intimidating, that it creates a distance I don't intend." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I want you to know, Leo, that your presence here, first as a professional and now as a guest, it's been welcome. The quiet has been a little less quiet." He held my gaze. "I just want to be sure you feel comfortable, that you feel you are here by choice." There it was again, his constant, gentle reinforcement of my autonomy. He wasn't just being kind. He was actively working to balance the power between us. He was telling me that he was aware of the potential for me to feel trapped or obligated, and he was giving me the key to the door. My heart felt too big for my chest. This man, this steady, kind, and quietly lonely man, was seeing me more clearly than anyone had in years. And he was letting me see him, too. The fear that had been my constant companion began to recede, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated affection. "I do," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I feel very welcome, Arthur. Thank you." We finished our dinner in a comfortable silence, the unspoken feelings between us now a warm, living presence in the room. The professional contract was over. Something new, something fragile and personal, was beginning. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to see what it could become. The project was officially completed the next day, but my presence in Arthur's apartment did not end. He found other reasons for me to be there. First, it was a small retainer contract to manage the new website. Then, it was a request for my opinion on the art he was considering for the Foundation's office. He invented reasons, plausible and professional, but we both knew what they were: an excuse to continue sharing the same space, to let this fragile, budding connection grow. The dynamic between us shifted. The touches became less accidental. A hand would rest on my shoulder for a moment longer as he looked at my screen. He would stand a little closer than necessary when we were in the kitchen making coffee. The air was thick with a delicious, simmering tension. We were circling each other, two planets slowly being drawn into the same orbit, the gravity between us growing stronger each day. The tipping point came at a small fundraising event for the Foundation. Arthur had invited me as his guest. "I'd like you to be there," he'd said. "You're a part of this now. You helped build it." I was a nervous wreck, dressed in a suit I'd bought from a consignment shop, feeling like an imposter among the city's elite. But Arthur stayed by my side, a calm, grounding presence. He introduced me simply as Leo, the designer who created our new online presence. He spoke of my work with genuine pride, making me feel not like an accessory, but like a valued partner. Late in the evening, we were standing by the bar when a man I recognized from the society pages, a real estate mogul named Marcus Thorne, approached us. He was loud and brash, his eyes sweeping over me with a dismissive, calculating glance. "Vance," he boomed, clapping Arthur on the shoulder. "Good to see you out. And who's this?" His gaze lingered on me, a smirk playing on his lips. "Found yourself a new protege." The word protege was loaded, dripping with insinuation. It implied a power dynamic that was transactional, dismissive of my own agency and talent. I felt my face flush with a mixture of anger and humiliation. I saw in his eyes the easy, cruel assumption that I was here for Arthur's money, a young thing to be kept and discarded. Before I could even think of a reply, Arthur's demeanor changed. The calm, gentle man I knew was gone, replaced by someone with an edge of cold steel. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The temperature around us seemed to drop by 10 degrees. He moved to stand ever so slightly in front of me, a subtle, protective gesture. "This is Leo," he said, his voice quiet but laced with an unmistakable warning. "He is a gifted designer and my respected colleague. And he is here tonight as my guest." He held Thorne's gaze, his gray eyes like chips of ice. "Choose your next words carefully, Marcus." Thorne, who was used to bullying his way through life, actually took a step back. He stammered a hasty, insincere apology and quickly made his escape. The moment he was gone, Arthur turned to me, his expression softening with concern. "I'm sorry, Leo. You shouldn't have been subjected to that." I was speechless. My heart was pounding, but not from fear or humiliation anymore. It was from the fierce, unequivocal way he had defended me. He hadn't just corrected Thorne, he had shielded me. He had used his power not to control me, but to protect me. In that moment, the depth of his feelings for me was laid bare, more clearly than any declaration could have been. "Let's go," he said softly, his hand finding mine, his fingers lacing through my own. It wasn't a hesitant, accidental touch this time. It was deliberate, a claim, an anchor. He led me out of the crowded room, out onto a quiet, windswept terrace overlooking the glittering city. The cool night air was a relief against my hot skin. We stood in silence for a long time, his hand still holding mine, a warm, solid weight. The noise of the party faded into a distant murmur. "He was wrong," I said finally, my voice quiet. "About what he thought." Arthur turned to face me, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "I know," he said, "but it made me realize something. This ambiguity, it's not fair to you. It puts you in a vulnerable position." He let go of my hand and stepped closer, his gaze intense. "I have been hiding behind our professional arrangement, Leo, because I am 49 years old, and you are not. Because I have this life," he gestured to the city skyline, "and I didn't want to frighten you away or make you feel pressured. But I am not your mentor, and you are not my protege. And I am long past wanting to be just your client." My breath caught in my throat. This is it, the moment where everything changes. The air crackles. I can feel the beat of my own heart, a steady, insistent rhythm against my ribs. "What do you want, Arthur?" I ask, and my voice is surprisingly steady. I need to hear him say it. I need this one last piece of the puzzle to click into place. He looks at me, and all the caution, all the careful reserve, falls away from his face. What's left is a vulnerability that mirrors my own, a raw, honest yearning that takes my breath away. "I want you," he says, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I want to have breakfast with you. I want to hear about your day. I want to walk our dog in the park, together. I want to see where this goes, with no pretenses and no ambiguity. If you'll let me," he pauses, his eyes searching mine. "What do you want, Leo?" The question hangs in the cool night air, simple and direct. He is not assuming. He is asking. He is giving me the final, most important choice. And the answer is the easiest thing in the world. It rises up from the deepest part of me, a truth I've been holding for weeks. I am not the scared, broken person who stumbled into this park a month ago. I am the man who was seen and valued and protected by this incredible, steady man. I think. I begin, a slow smile spreading across my face, a real one, full of a joy so pure it almost hurts. "I think I've been falling for you since I met your dog." Relief washes over his features, so profound it's like watching the sun break through the clouds. He closes the small space that remains between us, his hands coming up to gently cup my face. His palms are warm against my skin, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones with an infinite tenderness. He leans in, his gaze holding mine, and then he kisses me. It is not a kiss of frantic passion or pent-up demand. It is a kiss of arrival. It is slow and deep and sure, a perfect meeting of warmth and pressure. It tastes of wine and the cool night air and something that is just him. It is a question and an answer all in one. It is a promise. It feels, in a word, right. Like coming home to a place I didn't even know I was searching for. When he pulls back, he rests his forehead against mine. His eyes are closed, his breathing a little unsteady. My own heart is soaring. I lace my fingers with his again, holding on tight. So, he murmurs, his lips brushing against mine as he speaks. Breakfast. I laugh, a real, happy sound that seems to echo across the terrace. Yes, I say. Breakfast. The morning after was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the tense, unspoken silence of before, but a soft, settled calm. I woke up in his bed, the sheets smelling of him, the early morning light filtering through the blinds. He was already awake, sitting in a chair by the window, a mug of coffee in his hands, just watching me. A flicker of the old insecurity surfaced. The night had been perfect, a gentle, unhurried exploration of touch and feeling that was more intimate than anything I had ever known. But in the harsh light of day, the realities of our lives, his wealth, my precarious finances, the gaping difference in our ages, felt stark and unavoidable. Was last night a beautiful, isolated moment, or was it the start of something real? He must have seen the question in my eyes. He stood up and came to sit on the edge of the bed, his expression gentle. "Good morning," he said softly. "Morning," I replied, my voice still thick with sleep. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his touch feather-light. "No regrets?" he asked, his gaze searching mine. "None," I said, and it was the absolute truth. "Are you?" "No," he answered before I could even finish. "My only regret is that I didn't tell you how I felt sooner." He took a slow breath. "But I want to be very clear, Leo. I don't want you to feel kept or dependent. Your independence is important. Your work is important." He stood up and walked over to his desk, picking up 2 envelopes. He handed one to me. It was a check for the final payment on the website project, along with the signed retainer contract. "This is business," he said, his voice firm. "This is for the work you've done and the work you will do. It has nothing to do with us." Then he handed me the second envelope. Inside was a single key. "And this," he said, his voice softening, "is personal. It's a key to this apartment. Not because I expect you to move in, but because I want you to feel that this is your space, too. That you can come and go as you please. No strings, no expectations. Just an open door." I looked from the check to the key, my throat tight with emotion. He was so careful, so deliberate in separating the professional from the personal. He was using his resources not to bind me to him, but to grant me more freedom, more security. He was actively working to build a partnership of equals, despite the world seeing us as anything but. "Arthur," I whispered, not knowing what else to say. "We'll take it slow," he said, sitting beside me again. "We'll figure it out. A real date. Dinner, somewhere that isn't here. A walk in the park that doesn't end with one of us going home alone." He took my hand, his thumb tracing patterns on my palm. "We just start." And we did. That first week was a strange and wonderful navigation. There was a public moment that could have been a test. We were having lunch at a small cafe downtown when a woman, a friend of Arthur's, stopped by our table. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly as she took in the scene, Arthur and me. "Arthur, darling," she said, her voice a little too bright. "How lovely to see you. And you've brought a friend." The word hung there, just as protégé had. But this time, I wasn't afraid. And Arthur didn't get cold. He just smiled, his hand resting warmly on my arm. "Eleanor, how nice to see you." "This is Leo," he said, his voice full of casual, unmistakable pride. "My partner." The words settled between us, solid and true. Eleanor blinked, recalibrated, and offered me a polite, if slightly stunned, smile. When she walked away, Arthur looked at me, a questioning look in his eyes. "Was that all right?" I squeezed his hand. "It was perfect. We found our rhythm." Some nights I stayed at his penthouse. Other nights I went back to my own small apartment, a space that felt less like a fortress now and more like my own quiet corner of the world. The key he gave me felt heavy and significant in my pocket, a symbol of trust and belonging. He never pressured me to use it, but knowing it was there changed everything. A few weeks after that night on the terrace, I woke up early on a Saturday morning in his apartment. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Arthur was still asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. Atlas was snoozing on his dog bed at the foot of our bed. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen. I made coffee, the motions familiar and comfortable in this space that no longer felt intimidating. It felt like home. I took 2 mugs out onto the main balcony, the one that overlooked the park where we had first spoken. The city was still quiet, the air cool and clean. I watched the sun climb higher, feeling a sense of peace that was so profound it was almost overwhelming. A pair of strong arms wrapped around me from behind, and Arthur's chin rested on my shoulder. He had pulled on a robe, his hair endearingly messy from sleep. "Couldn't sleep?" he murmured into my ear. "Just thinking," I said, leaning back against his solid warmth. He turned me around to face him, his hands on my waist. "About what?" I looked into his clear, gray eyes, the eyes of the man who had seen me when I felt invisible. "About how different everything is," I said. "A few months ago, I was sitting on a bench down there, completely alone. I had built my life around not needing anyone. And now," he prompted gently. "And now," I said, my hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "Now I know that needing someone isn't a weakness. Not when it's the right someone," I smiled. "Choosing to build something with you feels like the strongest thing I've ever done." He kissed me then, a soft, lingering kiss full of morning coffee and easy affection. It wasn't a climactic, world-altering kiss like the first one had been. It was something better. It was the quiet, comfortable kiss of a new beginning, of a life that was just getting started. Later that morning, we walked down to the park. The autumn leaves were a riot of color, and the air was crisp. Arthur held my hand, his grip warm and sure. Atlas trotted happily between us, his leash passed back and forth, a simple, tangible link connecting our 2 worlds. We weren't the wealthy man and the young designer anymore. We were just Leo and Arthur. And for the first time in my life, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.